I think I'll begin because I know it's a packed session and we want to use all the time we have available. So welcome everyone, bienvenue à tous et à toutes. This session will be happening in English, but we do have simultaneous interpretation available through the icon, the interpretation icon at the bottom of the page. Donc, je vais juste répéter en français pour commencer. Donc, si vous ne comprenez pas bien l'anglais, vous pouvez accéder à l'interprétation simultanée en cliquant sur l'icône d'interprétation qui est juste en bas de votre écran Zoom. Sachez que la session va se dérouler principalement en anglais, mais vous pouvez toujours demander des questions en français. So, I will continue with the land acknowledgement and then a few short announcements before we begin with the remainder of the session. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that the CCR office is in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, which is situated on the Indigenous traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we meet today. Because this session is open to the public, I will also just say a few words about the Canadian Council for Refugees. So the Canadian Council for Refugees is a leading voice for rights, protection, sponsorship, settlement, and well-being of refugees and migrants in Canada and globally. And the CCR is driven by member organizations working with, from, and for these communities from coast to coast to coast. If you are not already a member of the CCR, we encourage you to consider joining either as an organization or as an associate member. And you can find more information about this process on our website. This session is currently being made available for free, but we also encourage, as CCR is a charitable organization, anyone who is in a position to contribute. We would be very happy to receive your donation, which enables us to continue offering more sessions to the public for free. I will now share a brief message on the power wheel. Just a second. So what you are seeing now is a diagram of the Canadian Council for Refugees power wheel. This is an anti-oppression tool, that we use in our events to remind people to reflect on the way in which they experience privilege, to facilitate more equal exchanges between participants. So as you can see, we have a number of different categories which are on the outside of the wheel. And the closer you are to the center, the more privilege you occupy in that category. So you can access the tool on our website, but we ask everyone to consider this when we have sessions for different topics. And you can read more about it at the link that Rahul has posted in the chat. I will stop sharing now. So thank you so much for joining us on this very important session related to migration and climate. And I will pass it now to Carrie. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's so great to see you all here. My name is Carrie McCluskey. I am the coordinator of the Vicarious Trauma and Resilience Initiative at Aurora Family Therapy in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I will be one of your moderators for today's event. Very excited to be able to be a part of this and to learn from our presenters today as a PhD student in peace and conflict and part of the newcomer serving community. It's just such an important topic that I think we could all use a lot more information and guidance on, and I think it's going to be the beginning of many future conversations. I would invite everybody to enter any questions you have during our presentations in the Q&A or in the chat if that's easier for you, and we will be sure to have time to get into that and have some conversation at the end of our presentations. Before we get started, I have a few thank yous I would like to make to the organizers who are bringing this event together, Asma Fazi, Geneviève Binville, Yomi Trosai, Al-Mustafa Abbas, and of course our amazing CCR team that is just so supportive and helpful when it comes to putting these events together and getting the information out to the community. Our presenters, of course, thank you so much for being here. We will have more thorough introductions for each of them. For now, I will turn it over to our other moderator, Mark.
Hi, yes, I'm Mark Bigland-Pritchard. I'm the SAR rep for Mennonite Central Committee in Saskatchewan. I've been in that job for the last 6.5 years. So I'm based in Saskatoon in Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. But in addition to that, I've got a background in physics applied to clean energy and green building. I kind of made a career shift 6.5 years ago. And I've been active in the climate justice movement, both in local secular initiatives and in church-based organizing provincially and nationally. So this is kind of my subject, I suppose, but without the sort of expertise that people who've been on the ground, like our speakers, will be able to bring. So just to give you a bit of an introduction, in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, not to be confused with the IRCC, published a report on the scientific research at the time around the impacts of different increases in temperature, in global temperature. And it showed that permitting the Earth's average surface temperature to rise by 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels would bring disastrous consequences in terms of intensity of floods, droughts, heat waves, forest fires, cyclones, biodiversity loss, food security, and the list goes on. They found that staying within this 1.5 degree guardrail would require global emissions of carbon dioxide, mostly from burning fossil fuels, that is, to be steadily reduced, cut by half by 2030, and reduced to zero by about 2050. But this has not been happening. Emissions have continued to rise globally. We are nowhere near on track to halve emissions by 2030, let alone to reach net zero by 2050. And last year, well ahead of most of the predictions, the climate gave the scientific community a rather nasty surprise by giving us the first year on the wrong side of that 1.5 degree guardrail. Now, was that a blip, or has the science been optimistic even in its gloomy predictions? We don't yet know, but what we do know is that we face a global emergency. And it's particularly an emergency for already vulnerable people in the global south. It's mostly Black and brown people with low incomes, and especially women and children, who bear the brunt of the droughts, the floods, the heat waves, the loss of land to the sea that result predominantly from the emissions of rich, white-led nations. The climate crisis isn't only an environmental issue, it's also a matter of fundamental human justice. We're talking about it here because it is increasingly a driver of the forced displacement of people. But the details are far from simple. In its massive 2022 report, the IPCC looked seriously for the first time at impact on migration, and it found with high confidence that, and I quote, Climatic conditions, events, and variability are important drivers of migration and displacement, with migration responses to specific climate hazards being strongly influenced by economic, social, political, and demographic processes. And they went on to say, in many regions, the frequency and/or severity of floods, extreme storms, and droughts is projected to increase in coming decades, especially under high emission scenarios, raising future risk of displacement in the most exposed areas. But it also filled several pages explaining that the situation is complicated, that there are many factors involved, that the same type of climate event can have a totally different result in one location from another. Indeed, that in some places, migration might actually be reduced because people lack the resources to move. Climate impacts can be characterized as rapid onset, such as extra strong cyclones or wildfires, or slow onset, such as multi-year droughts or extended flooding. Life-threatening heat waves could come in either category. You know, if they will increase short-term mortality rates if they're brief, but they may not have other enduring impacts there. But if they're long or repeated, they could have a devastating long-term effect. So in linking displacement to climate change, there are two stages of attribution of, you know, is this a cause for this? The first stage is scientific. You know, to what extent did human-generated global heating intensify the extreme weather event? And for some recent work on this, I refer you to, I'll just put it in the chat, worldweatherattribution.org. This is professional analysis by international teams, which has shown, for example, the contribution of global heating to the multi-year drought in the Horn of Africa a few years ago, to the recent heat waves in South Sudan, to the extreme floods across the Sahel from northern Nigeria to Sudan last year, to the extraordinary series of typhoons which hit the Philippines last November, and to many other weather events. So that's the first stage of attribution, but the second stage is about how people react. And that will depend on the type of event, and it will depend on the local social and economic context. In the case of rapid onset, people will not want to move far. They'll want to get back to their homes and to their traditional livelihoods as quickly as they possibly can, provided they're not blocked from doing so. But with slow onset events, it can be more complicated. Migration may start with one or two family members leaving the farm or the herds and seeking work in town to supplement meager farm income. Or they may return if conditions improve. But if people are facing, say, a fifth successive season of drought, or if the frequency of drought years is increasing, conditions may never improve enough for them to return. And then they may be bad enough for the whole family to move, initially with the intention of returning, but ultimately the choice may be long-term migration, moving away for at least a year to a new place of residence, generally within the same country, but maybe ultimately across an international border. As global temperatures rise, increasing numbers of people will become displaced in this way. But there's a more common, I think more significant, and certainly more insidious way in which climate change drives migration. And that's as a powerful multiplication factor, a powerful amplification factor in an already fragile or dangerous situation. So lots of mutually interacting factors can come into play. There's local conflicts, levels of inequality, government policy towards agriculture, the human rights situation, the women's rights situation, the presence of extractive industry, and so on, and so on, and so on. And climate change can be expected to magnify and complicate any and all negative impacts. Now, these obviously vary a lot from place to place. So we should expect the levels of forced migration to vary a lot from place to place, even between geographically close places which have experienced the same climate impacts. So the record drought in 2006 to 2010 in the Middle East, that combined with government policy in Syria to produce a catastrophe. But that catastrophe didn't materialize in Eastern Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon. because the local factors were different, especially in terms of government policy. And in places where there is already conflict over land, the response to loss of production through drought or flood can be outbreaks of violence. But in other places, the outcome could be cooperative solidarity. So, as I keep saying, it's complicated. Even as climate change is an increasingly significant factor in reasons for displacement, including among convention refugees, but not only among convention refugees, it would be difficult to devise a clear definition of a climate refugee. And it makes sense to look at impacts one place at a time. So that's what our two speakers are going to do now. Our first speaker is Dr. Yvonne Su. Yvonne is the director of the Centre for Refugee Studies at York University in Toronto. She's a specialist in forced migration, post-disaster recovery, climate change-induced displacement, and queer migration. She's conducted research on post-disaster recovery in the Philippines for over a decade. Dr. Su has worked extensively with vulnerable communities in Southeast Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean, including refugees, asylum seekers, undocumented migrants, trans sex workers, indigenous communities, and 2S LGBTQIA+ folks. So over to you, Dr. Yvonne Su.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for organizing this. I think, as you noted, it's very important and a topic that is of growing concern for most people, and it's great to see such a lively group here. So I'm covering kind of climate migration futures, this idea that I'll talk a bit about the past, a little bit on what Mark has already touched on, but also how we could grow towards perhaps a bolder, a more proactive, a decolonial, and a critical climate migration research agenda. So a lot of youth, a lot of my students are really interested in this topic, but some of the questions that they're coming up with are quite dated because we're not having very active conversations about this topic, or they're stuck in literature that is very focused on whether we call them refugees or migrants, but we've really moved on beyond those conversations. So I'm here to kind of have a more forward and future-facing discussion. And I would be in trouble if I am the director of the Refugee Study Center and I do not promote our summer course, which is on this exact topic. It's from June 2nd to 6th, and we're giving 50% off for virtual participants for their fees right now. So if you like this talk, please go on our website and check us out. So I'll start with a couple of pictures. And the first, this is, I don't know if many of you guys might recognize this, but this was the Pakistan flood in 2022. And it was devastating. And millions of people were impacted, and a third of the country was affected by this. This very iconic is the LA fires. A $250 to $275 billion is expected to be the loss. And it's always very challenging to think about billions. So to give you an idea, that is one Jeff Bezos. That's Jeff Bezos' net worth. That's how much has been damaged in the fires and the horrible stories of people being evacuated, etc. But it's also a very complicated story because many of these were built on more vulnerable, environmentally vulnerable areas. And then this is, bringing it back home. This was Northwest Territories, and it's more of a happy story in the sense that due to very effective evacuations, see how orderly it is, right? And well warning systems, we were able to evacuate in a very timely manner. But the mayor, the premier, people were still saying that a lot more aid has to be provided so that we don't have to evacuate, or that there could be better measures in place, and that the territory is really underfunded when it comes to climate change disasters and disasters in general. And then this is Lytton, BC, probably one of the most iconic, maybe isn't not the right word, but in the sense that there were so many videos of people escaping in their trucks, and there was just fire all around them in their trucks. And there is a very poignant quote that I read on a YouTube video of all things. And it says that we all see these on our screens until it's our screen recording the fire around us. And I think that's very important because in Canada, because of our large geography, because of our perhaps our politics, or the fact that we until very recently, like to look outwards and not look inwards. There is this idea that we're not impacted by things like climate change, or we're not as impacted by things like disasters. But here we are with a community that had minutes to evacuate, and 90% of Lytton, BC was burned down. And it's not a surprise that it's also a heavily Indigenous community. And I'll talk about that later on in the PowerPoint. But I bring this to illustrate the global reach of climate change, disasters, and displacement. And some of the kind of more challenging discourse that emerge is this one, which many of you would have heard about, which is the idea that a lot of this is coming from the global south to the global north. And I've got two really prominent media outlets. You've got The Guardian, we've got New York Times, and they're both saying that there's going to be so much migration, so much climate migration, we need to plan for it. And they talk about it in a sense of danger and insecurity. And again, global south to global north. And what we know from the data is that that's not true. Mark had mentioned a lot of the displacement is going to be happening internally, but also it's going to be happening within the global south. And then it's not everybody wants to come to the global north, right? Especially with all the things that are happening right now. So it's really important to put that narrative in context and be very mindful not to play into it. And it got so extreme in 2007, and really this narrative's not gone away, that Christian Aid had written this, what they really truly thought was a very well-informed and I guess helpful argument that there was going to be a human tide of people. What two words that should never come together, right? So they paint this image, and then they do a miscalculation that was misquoted in the media of 1 billion climate refugees. And that's where a lot of my work started more than 10 years ago. Because I was like, what is this 1 billion? How could there be 1 billion climate refugees? So I looked into the math, I interviewed the individuals that wrote the report, and I found out that this 1 billion figure is a combination of all different types of migration and mobility and displacement happening by 2050, right? So they took an amalgamation of numbers, they added up to 1 billion, but the media and themselves, to a certain extent, went with the 1 billion climate refugees. So if you ever wonder where that came from, this is where it came from. And when I spoke with the author, he let me know that he was using a very sexy topic of climate refugees at the time to draw attention to a not very sexy topic, which is internal displacement, which is, again, what most climate migration is going to be. But we really have to be careful of that because we live in such a world of fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. And this 1 billion number has been used to almost weaponize against narratives of providing any type of protection from people who are displaced. You know, for those who you're seeing in Pakistan, in LA even, or in Canada, or anywhere in the world, that climate should not be a factor. And I learned this, and there's one more thing, which is that the reason this whole conversation is a little confusing is because it's very complicated. So this is the Maldives. And it's very common for people to talk about the Maldives and other small island states to say that they are going to go underwater. So this is what we get advertised Maldives looks like. And then we think, okay, yeah, like they're going to go underwater, but you also don't see many people. You don't see many locals. You don't really understand what local people in Maldives, how they live. That's because they live like this. This is the capital of the Maldives, and it is one of the most densely populated places ever. It does not look like the paradise which we see above and it gets advertised by vacation packages to us. And it was so overpopulated that they built an artificial island right next to it. They couldn't get people to relocate to other outer islands, one, because the land was much more valuable being used for vacation, but two, they all wanted to be close to the airport and the main transportation and financial hubs, and that all makes sense. So what did they do? A few years ago, they just built an artificial island, right? But what are the consequences of that? You know, what are the environmental consequences of that? It's a lot of sand mining. That's a lot of engineering that has to go in there, and we don't know how sustainable that is. So I would articulate that that is some form of extreme climate adaptation. And that's kind of the world that we're entering in extreme climate adaptation to deal with these issues of climate migration, climate displacement, and overpopulation for a place like this. And then this is the president of the Maldives during that time. And, you know, there was a really good film, which many of you should see if you can get access, which is The Island President, in which he talks about trying to save this beautiful country that he loves. But all this to explain that it's a very complicated topic because there's often so many factors and we only often see one side of it, right? When there is multi-sides of it. And very quickly, and I learned all of this very abruptly when I went to Oxford to study climate refugees. And the year that I went to Oxford to study climate refugees in 2011, I was told climate refugees do not exist. So imagine, I've got all this I'm all this debt, and I go to Oxford, and I think I'm going to learn about climate refugees, and they tell me it doesn't exist. And they don't exist because of this pentagon, this diagram, which says that climate migration cannot be monocausal. You can never say that climate change caused migration because there's so many other factors. And this is really, truly what is happening. I totally agree with that. And the argument is that climate change overlays environment, political, social, economic, demographic challenges and drivers, and should not be seen as alone. And then you'll also know that on the other side, there's the decision to leave, and there's personal household characteristics. And I would say we've done a lot of research on the side about the drivers, but we've done less research about the impact. And this is where a lot of future work can be done. So we want to ask, like, the part on this side is a bit blurry and it's under research and it needs further problematization, because what about those who migrate and then return and then they migrate again and they return and they migrate again, right? It's not so simple as stay or go. And many people who've done any work on migration will know it's not that simple. And then there's the question of what about those who do stay, but they migrate internally? And what about those who are trapped, who don't have the demographic or the social or the cultural or the educational factors or just money to be able to move? And most importantly, many people don't want to move, right? So what about those aspects? So those are all areas we can do more research in. So the new climate frontiers and climate migration in general, I have to say, is complicated. It's nonlinear, it's multi-locational, it's circular or repetitive, it's north to south, but it's also south to south. And I would even argue that it's going to be just going it's going to be so many different places people are going, and it's really hard to capture, and it's really hard to simplify, and we really shouldn't try. Right? It's not just vulnerability and resilience, and those narratives are both helpful and harmful. To say that it's just on this spectrum, it's much more complicated than that. And certain things that make some groups vulnerable actually make other groups resilient. And some things that make certain groups resilient actually make other groups vulnerable. So resilient, vulnerable for who? And these new frontiers are the things that happen in between. They're often invisible, and they're also often unintended. Right? So for example, that giant island. Oh yes, a lot of people can now live on there, and the capital is no longer as crowded. But what are the unintended consequences of building a giant artificial island, right? And who are impacted? And other cases of relocation is there are 42 villages which Fiji is now relocating inland. And Fiji is really important because it's one of the first countries to do a more holistic approach to relocation. And that my colleague, Dr. Erica Bauer, which is going to be a speaker at the summer course, she was involved in actually making the plan. And she told me it's the hardest thing she's ever done as like an academic, because you have everything on paper and you think it makes sense. And then you speak to people, of course, and it doesn't make sense at all. For example, what do you do with the graveyards, the burial sites? I don't know, right? This is something that you can't really factor in. You can't put in a matrix, right? It's very personal, right? Do you exhume the bones, the sites, right? Do you let them wash into the sea, right? It's also very cultural, very social, and very specific to groups, religious groups, or exactly where you're from. So it's also not a template you can borrow from another country, right? Now, I do a lot of research in the Philippines, and I have a video, but I'm not going to show it, but this is two pictures of the exact same spot. The first one is 2015 when I was doing field work after Typhoon Haiyan struck the Philippines. And you see this building there, which is ruined. It was actually run into by a giant tanker ship, one of those ones with the shipping containers, because 13 of them ran ashore in the Tacloban. And it destroyed the community, and it killed a bunch of people. And this community had to be completely demolished. And when I was studying it, it was all theoretical. Here it is, gone. This was 2020. This was just last summer in July. I was so emotional going back to the place that I had been, and I'm actually seeing a community erased, destroyed, right? Demolished, and with grass grown over. Something I was understanding theoretically was actually taking place. So you notice like there's I won't point it out, but they're the same place. And it was just insane to be there. And they all got relocated an hour north in a place that has a lot less livelihoods and a lot less social connections, but arguably to be safer. But again, safer for who, safer why. And I'm Mark, I'm probably running out of time. How much longer do I have?
Oh, a few more minutes.
Okay. I just want to draw attention to some alternatives, though, because a lot of people were very unhappy to be relocated, as you can imagine, away from their livelihoods, away from their history. And some of the alternatives are relocating them in place. Some of the reasons why that's not popular is because often the land they live on is valuable, and they were not able to get rid of these people from other reasons. So for example, this place that I showed you is right by the coast, and has traditionally been slum dwellers that have lived there. They build their homes on stilts into the sea, and arguably it's unsafe or unsanitary, but they've been there for generations, and the city has not been able to get rid of them. Well, with Typhoon Haiyan, they were able to say there's going to be a no build zone. Right, so that's why they had to be moved, because you can't build anything there. A few years later, after they realized that you could gain a lot from coastal communities, coastal hotels, cafes, restaurants, they changed it from a no build zone to a no dwelling zone. Right, so therefore you can't build back in place because they're saying people can't live there. We're going to build there, hotels, etc., but not people. Another approach which was fascinating was a child-friendly approach. It was in one community where they let the kids choose which color to paint the different relocation houses in. I thought that was really lovely. And another one which I've never seen before, which is so important and arguably so obvious, which was let the local community choose which beneficiaries or which people to get aid first. Because often they're invisible things to us, people who might have disabilities or invisible disabilities, people who are widowed or have been abandoned, right? They are often within their homes, or they can't come out to the consultations as much, but their community members know, and they can get prioritized over someone who can line up and wait 2 or 3 hours in line to get assessed by Red Cross or any of these organizations. And then another point is that we need to ensure that even if organizations are saying that their work is culturally sensitive, it actually is culturally sensitive. This is a community, it's an indigenous community that I was in the Philippines, and they say it is a culturally sensitive co-creation of a relocation site. And then I just asked a very simple question, which was, so what Bajau indigenous knowledge did you integrate into the resettlement? Nothing. What climate adaptation approaches did you take from the Bajau to integrate into this program? Nothing. They just didn't ask them. So cultural sensitivity means very different things to very different people. When it comes to a situation of displacement and relocation, it's very important that the people who are being displaced and relocated are consulted and involved. And I know I'm out of time, but I'll skip this through because it's a Canadian aspect, but I think many of us can apply those lessons to Canada. So with Lytton, BC, after 3 years, there's not much rebuilding has been done. And there's been lots of fighting about building back better for who? Or are we building back better? Some people are saying that they just want to go home. They don't care about fire resiliency. They don't care about fire safe homes. They don't care about a model village. They just want to go home. And then, of course, these questions of who pays for this? A lot of the issues were insurance. Insurance pays back the home that you lost, not the home that you want. So any fire resiliency, any type of additions or anything that would improve your house in case there's another wildfire because you're in a wildfire dangerous zone, they won't cover it. So maybe that's where the government comes in with a program that will give you 10,000 or 15,000 one-time recovery so that you could build back a better home as opposed to building back the exact same home, which was already vulnerable, then spending money to take that home apart to build things that will make it more safe. And then indigenous communities, the last thing I'll say is indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted. And this is really important to note because many people, I don't think, were aware of this, but in 2011, the government diverted water as a flood threatened Winnipeg. The diverted water created a super flood in Lake St. Martin. And so what they did was they changed a natural hazard into a human-made flood because they chose where the flood water was going to go. And this caused a large evacuation, a large devastation. And this is important because in January 2022, the Manitoba Court of Queen's Bench ordered an $85.5 million settlement, which is huge, one of the largest for anyone who owned real or personal property near Lake St. Martin, because the evacuation was caused by humans making this decision to say, we want to avoid Winnipeg being hit, but we'll let an Indigenous community be hit. So that's some of the really dark history that we have to contend with in Canada that we likely don't talk about. So I will finish because I know I'm probably way over time, but this is a summer course. And then also tomorrow, I'm speaking with Dr. Hinder also on this topic if you want to join us, and you can just look it up at the CRS website. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. I wish we had more time. I'm sure you've got much, much more to say, but I'll pass back to Carrie.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much, Dr. Sue. That was fabulous and so informative in such a short amount of time. I agree. I think there's a whole lot more we could continue to learn. And we will continue to learn. Dr. Mohammed is our next presenter, joining us from Sudan. Dr. Mohammed is a medical doctor and professional emergency operations coordinator at Federal Ministry of Health Sudan. His work is deeply rooted in the intersection of climate change and health through disaster risk reduction. He views the challenges posed by climate change as a catalyst for rethinking how health systems are designed, advocated for a shift from reactive healthcare to proactive community-driven resilience. Dr. Mohammed focuses on empowering communities, particularly youth, to lead the creation of sustainable health systems that adapt to environmental changes. By tailoring responses to local needs, he champions the idea that true resilience lies in the ability of communities to govern their own health in a rapidly changing world. His work aims to bridge the gap between global environmental threats and local health solutions, fostering systems that are both resilient and adaptable. Welcome, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for having me. Just double check if you can hear me.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark and Dr. Sue, for your presentation and for setting the scene. And that's I think that's very good for I'm not having like a presentation, but I would like to reflect on the experience that we had here in Sudan in the climate and climate change and migration from a perspective of health. And I'll build up on the many of the points. First, I would like to experiencing that many effects of climate change, as Mark had said before, it can be sudden onset disaster like floods that we experience flood through the past several years. And the thing about floods is quite unpredictable at the moment, and is people disproportionately. At the same time, we're facing the droughts as long-term effect. However, the context of as the part have been mentioned, there are two rational climate change and migration is quite difficult. those who have been experiencing this to rationale the migration from rural to urban, if it's due to climate change, as well as the conflict for years. Many people that have been written in the conflict have been prescribed. The conflict is deeply rooted due to climate. All right. Okay. So I was saying that is quite better for the internet to close the camera. So yeah. The conflict have been rooted due to the climate change, military share. They heavily relying this on the on the lifestyle of the people in the rural area, because Sudan is mostly rural area, and then people, when they migrate to urban area, this is quietly
Did we lose him? Just a moment, folks. We'll see if we can get him back in. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, to please enter them in the Q&A option or in the chat.
I think we all understand the difficulties that Dr. Mohammed is facing in trying to connect with us from Sudan. But I guess now is the time for questions until he can reconnect. So if anybody has questions, please come up with them. Or comments.
I have a question, Yvonne. You mentioned that a lot of the work that's being done now by researchers or graduate students is dated. What would be a better approach? So someone like myself, who maybe is really just getting acquainted with this, like the extent of the issue. How do I avoid falling into that?
Yeah, I think that's a common trap. And I think some of it is because the research that's real and on the ground is very challenging to do and really hard to engage with. So for example, this topic I brought up about graveyards. How does one study that? They have to be on the ground, or they have to have a cultural understanding or a social understanding, right? Or these decisions about how to move, where to move, when to move, if they're moving, coming back, etc. A lot of that involves a lot of field work and a lot of research that implies that you have to spend a lot of time in those communities. So I've been doing work in the Philippines for more than 10 years, right? And I know a lot of students don't have that time or would find field work or more qualitative or in-depth work more intimidating. But I think that's kind of where the encouragement has to come from. So to talk about refugees versus migrants is a very top level, kind of easy to have conversation, right? It's in the law, it's not in the law. And there's that diagram made it seem so simple, right? These factors exist or not. But anybody here who have had lived experiences or who've had to decide if they were going to move, whether for school or for love or for jobs, right? Like we know it's very complicated. We know it's not, let's go look at this diagram and figure out which factors are important. And that's my decision right there. So I think we just have to encourage people to get into the messiness of these things. And as I always argue, like to look and see the human side of it, right? Because the simpler questions are often not human questions. They're questions about law or economics or the higher up things, which involve humans fundamentally. But the way the questions are asked draw us away from the complicated messiness that human beings are. So that's what I always encourage my students to do, or to ask more forward focused questions. So Tuvalu is digitalizing their nation. And when I first heard about it, I thought it was a gimmick. I thought it was a really clever media gimmick to draw attention to their country and also the issues that they're facing with climate change and sea level rise. But no, they're serious. They're very serious. And every piece of their country is being documented and uploaded on Meta. Right. And they're using blockchain and other technology to create passports, digital passports, and they want to make a digital territory because the threat, especially now with a US president that is very neocolonial or imperial or really wants to take over territory, is that if you lose the physical land of a territory, you're by international law not sovereign. So sovereignty is tied to a piece of land. So what happens when that land disappears underwater as a result of climate change? Yes, sure, this could be an issue that's really taking place in 2050, 2070, but the young folks, the students that I'm working with, they will live until then. The people of Tuvalu will live until then. So they do need to figure out a solution to the very real problem of what happens when their piece of land, their ancestral land, starts to go underwater and they need a new place to live, but they also need new claims. Because it's not just the piece of land that's important, it's the nautical miles beyond that land, the international territory, the economic zone where there's mining, there's resources, there's fish, there's coral, there's lots of money to be made around the resources around an island. So the question is, who gets that money? Who gets the resources? Are there going to be future generation of Tuvaluans who don't live on Tuvalu, perhaps live in Australia or New Zealand or even Canada? Do they get dividends? I don't know. So to me, those are really exciting questions that I like to pose to my students because it really gets their brain going, right? And it also inspires them to say that I could be a part of these larger conversations.
Yeah, that's a whole lot more depth than discussing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark, did you have a? Eva,
Oh,
please
we
go ahead.
have
You can
Eva.
unmute. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, Eva, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I really like this conversation because this is a topic that touched my heart and my life. I'm from Colombia, and I can say that I live all this situation in my own life when I was there for more than 20 years. And also it is great to listen that this topic is of importance here because it has been of importance for the global south, for these Black and brown communities, people from many years. And I can talk about the big impact that the mining industry, for example, from Canada, is having in Latin America. That is the region that I know better. And there are some researchers that they say that the 60% of the mining in Latin America is coming from Canada. Is going from Canada, and this is a lot. This is a lot, and I'm thinking about different populations losing land, losing water. First Nations, for example, the Wayuu population in Colombia and Venezuela, that is the largest indigenous population in Colombia. They lost the river Rancheria because it was taken for a big industry producing rice in the country and some other crops in the country. And the indigenous, they lost the only river they have to access to fresh water. Or that is happening, for example, with the Yanomami population in Brazil, northwest of Brazil, in a territory that is twice size of Switzerland. And the mining industry is taking the land and taking the rivers because they need this water and they need the land for the mining industry. Or in the smallest cases, like in Honduras, in Guapinol, 150 families that they lost the river and they have to move themselves from the countryside to the cities. And as they say, some fortunate people, they travel far away to other countries. However, this is people who is they were they own their own land. They own their small farms. They were producers. They were owners, and it has been for me really sad to find, for example, here in Canada, First Nations from Guatemala working here as temporary foreign workers. That is one of the sadness thing that I have found here. It is to find this First Nation, these indigenous from Guatemala as temporary working foreign workers in a farm, living these terrible conditions that we talk many times here in this kind of meetings that we do. So and something that like a question that I have to finish my point, sorry, is how to make a difference between mega industries such as mining, housing devastations, which is considered an effect of climate change. How to make a difference between these? Because some is the devastation, the deforestation, desertification that those big industries are causing, and also because they are producing climate change. So
No,
how
Eva,
to make a
this is
difference? How because there is a big responsibility they have, these industries, these economies.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is called carbon colonialism. Carbon colonialism. And it's the idea that we in the West get to live a very clean life in our Teslas, which are not being sold and going down in stock, but in our electric cars. And we think that we've done our part for the environment, whereas in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the global South, those people where the critical mineral mines are being mined are living devastating lives. Their health is devastated, their local environment is devastated, and of course they are displaced, right? So that's why I think that's kind of capturing what you're describing, right? And I think that's why climate change migration, climate change displacement is complicated. And because if you articulate the critical mineral mining, which has been articulated as a climate change action, right? We need to mine faster. We need to mine quicker, right? Because they're going to produce the electric cars, the electric batteries, and electrify our grids for a just transition, right? So some of the questions I asked about Build Back Better, I asked just transition for who, right? Not for those in the global South. And another stat that's interesting, but does not get a lot of attention, is that 69% of global mining projects are on indigenous or peasant land. 69%. That's huge, right? And it makes sense that those are the communities that are exploited, right? Both physically as they work there, but also as with their land because they hold very little power. And some countries might say that, well, they get a dividend, they get 1%, 2%, like we contribute back to the community. But in many of these more authoritarian countries, we know that also doesn't happen, right? So I like what you're pointing out, which is that we need to look at this more life cycle of something, right? So our phones, which has the cobalt, right? Our electric cars, which has the critical minerals. Where did they get drawn from, right? Who is being impacted by my sustainable choices? How sustainable are my choices? How just is this transition? So those are the things that I like to ask students to think about, because it really messes with them and makes them have to think about the world as a world. And that's some of the challenge too, is that on one hand, we're saying we're all impacted by climate change, we're all affected, and we all have to play a role. On the other hand, we know that is absolutely not true, right? Some places are devastated by climate change where other places aren't. So for example, us not using straws or plastic bags, in the West does very little for those in the global South. Because, for example, more sustainable practices of extracting critical minerals by a couple of Canadian companies could make a huge difference in terms of carbon, right? Way more than straws and plastic bags, right? Or way more than anybody in the global South, or any of the people I've spoken about that live on small island states who only contribute. So all the small island states together only contribute 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Think about that. And they're the first to be impacted extremely negatively by climate change, right? So we need to just question so many of these things. And yeah. And I think that connects to one of the questions about how can we in Canada, Organisation Canada, do better to support. And I think it's what I've just said about like making sure we're very critical. So this carbon colonialism, what are the things that may be green or sustainable in Canada? What is the life cycle of it? How is it negatively impacted source countries or other countries in the supply chain? Another thing about electric cars that we're all going to be faced with pretty soon is what do we do with the electric batteries, which are degrading? I don't think any of us feel comfortable driving around an electric car that's battery is not performing at 100%. So now we're going to have, especially if it's a Cybertruck, so what are we going to do with all these batteries now, right? So there's researchers looking at using them to say like power homes where you don't need to have 100% efficiency, right? So that's another sustainability aspect too, because recycling electric batteries takes a lot of energy and is very polluting. Like it messes with your mind, right? But each of the critical minerals separates at a different heat and different solutions. So it's actually a lot more work to recycle them. So I think as Canadians and in Canada, I think we can think about our consumer choices. But another thing really is to draw attention to the fact that it can happen here, right? So Lytton, BC was impacted 3 years ago. They have not been able to move back. They have not barely rebuilt. And the government is just very poorly structured in terms of how to deal with potential relocation and evacuation. They just don't want to do it. And it involves too many levels of government that don't like to talk to each other, right? So is this a municipal concern, a provincial concern, or a federal concern? And how do you incentivize communities to move proactively? We've got some examples in Newfoundland and around the Atlantic of islands that had to basically, they had to move because they got down to below 50 people, right? So we do have some lessons to learn, some voting, democratic approaches that were used in those places so that people could, but getting people to proactively move away from disaster, away from harm is very challenging. And there's not much political will to get that done. Nobody wants to be the politician or the prime minister that proactively moves communities. You don't win votes that way. You don't win votes by saving communities from wildfire. You unfortunately win them by saying that after the wildfire, you provided this many beds, you sent the military, and you got this much aid.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. For those that are able to stay with us, we do have Dr. Mohammed back. If we could maybe try and get an opportunity to learn a little bit more. Let's try that again.
Okay. Thank you, Carrie, and I apologize for the instability of the internet. Okay, but for the sake of time, the thing that I would like to focus on that the driver of the climate change and migration, it's overlapping with the social determinants of health. When we look at the migration, then we see the social determinants of health, and it's quite the same systematic barrier for people to reach to health. Although many declarations, although many efforts on a global level, on a national level, have been done as the universal health coverage that's aimed to reach to all people and to provide healthcare with all the quality of healthcare that accessible, that affordable, that it goes beyond the healthcare service and to provide more of health promotion activities and to do environmental wash activities. However, the interconnectedness and the driver that people face, especially the low onset driver of environmental factors, it led them to not really rationalize the climate factor. They more perceive it as economical factor from a perspective from the people who moved from area to area. In Sudan and in African country, I mean, like we are mostly due to the the disproportion between the rural and urban area and failure to urban planning to accommodate all those people with services. It's heavily increased the vulnerability of the system, institutional systems, and it bridged the gap between between inequalities. In terms of the short term onset, I mean, like floods, it had the biggest impact here in Sudan, especially due to the lack of early warning system and anticipatory action. Most people they faced direct impact from climate change, and this direct impact, it has very cascading events. It's very major event in terms of vector-borne disease, water related disease like cholera, like hemorrhagic fever, like malaria, and all this burden, it's only hinder the process of bridging the gap of the vulnerability of the patient and of the population. However, I think the climate change science itself is provide a good opportunity for to design adaptation measures that is environmentally sensitive, but is people-centered. And and the One Health approach here is very crucial to address this. Is mainly speaking about the interaction between human, and animal and environment. Many countries right now with putting the health of the population, having the definition of health beyond the healthcare service delivery as a state of well-being, and then adaptation with the lens of One Health approach is mainly goes with food and agriculture, but putting in mind all the system and the value change of the system, like you have to rely on civil society, you have to rely on small, medium enterprises, all the social protection measures that can help people to go beyond the systematic barrier in their home country. I agree with you in the south to south migration, because here in Sudan, like when we have faced with the conflict and with this very complex crisis, we have more than 11 million people have been displaced. 4 million of those people have been displaced to neighboring countries, mainly South Sudan, Chad, and Egypt. So yeah, I mean, like the direct impact of climate change is quite obvious and can be calculated in number, but the value of losses and damages in numbers is not really enough, because most people not they just don't lose building, or they just don't lose this amount of money. They less value of a home, they less values of a safety, and all this it has an indirect impact on the social system itself. And in terms of in a context of in a very developing countries, we rely more on aid, on organization and humanitarian aid, which itself is not quite helpful unless to be in an access approach that can take the community, participatory community engagement, so they can plan for the future for their own health. One of the missing factor is always here in developing country, we think of it as a privilege, the mental health of the people. especially in the low onset disasters like droughts. Many people they migrate not only in country but they cross borders. Maybe here in Sudan, they target Middle East, and sometimes they do the illegal migration to Europe and elsewhere. However, they choosing that different pairs here, and they choosing between two different pairs in Sudan and the one that they're gonna face in their host country. And I think here mental health is quite indicator for those who cross border to be taken into consideration. And when they arrive, I think the host communities.
This is unfortunate. We've lost Dr. Mohammed again. I'm prepared to stay here. Oh, he's coming back, I think. I'm prepared to stay here for, as long as it takes for Dr. Mohammed to say what he needs to say.
I was speaking about the mental health as an aspect that have been missing. Say again, sorry.
No, go ahead, Dr. Mohammed. I mean, we'll listen to you for as long as you've got something to say.
So, if you can hear me.
Yeah, it's good now.
Okay, all right. Thank you. So, all right, thank you very much. I was speaking about the mental health as one of the main indicators to be addressed because it has been missing throughout the process of migration, and especially in the low middle income countries, the mental health service is not accessible for everyone, and it's quite stigmatized and in the health system and in the response. People that sorry. So I'm just facing some sort of instability, but I'll try to connect the dots. So yeah, when it comes to the low onset impact of climate change, especially on the health of the migrant, is quite complex to understand their health and how it have been shaped from environment to cope with other environment, because whenever they go step by step, then they're gonna face more challenges, more systematic period. They're trying to cope, they're trying to adapt, and all these factors shaping their own health and the health of the population in general. However, mental health have been missed in many phases. This, especially the social system disruption that it happened, and then when people who have been migrated are mainly men and male, and all this has negative impact in the social aspect here in their home countries, as well as the brain drain itself and how this is affecting the whole system. However, well, I think people they choose between two barriers and be in the barriers here in climate change and environmental factor, but their perception seeking better life, they choose another systematic or barriers, especially that's to be integrated or to be settled down with the new more of engagement within the position and how can be lifestyle for them there. So I think that's all for now. I apologize for the instability of the internet and
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed, for, not just speaking across continents, but speaking across continents from a difficult location with a difficult communication on Zoom. So, thank you. And I mean, if you want to send us your text, Dr. Mohammed, then maybe we can distribute that so that we have a clearer idea of what you've been saying without the gaps. I guess we are actually running about 15 minutes late at the moment. So maybe now is the time to close down. I mean, I just kind of wonder if there are any final questions, any final comments, and I'll hand it back to Carrie for concluding remarks.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Aldabagi. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. And appreciate everyone's patience as we try. I mean, it's amazing that we're even being able to make the connection, and I can certainly appreciate some of the challenges with making that happen. Yvonne has put her email in the chat for anybody who has questions, and highly encourage anybody who is able to attend the summer institute. I'm hoping to participate myself. Thank you, CCR.
It's my job, Carrie, okay?
That's fabulous. Fabulous. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Be well. And we will see you soon.
Thank you.
you.